We're your trusted partners right by your side.
Evergreen Implement.
For all your farming needs, we're your go-to guy.
Evergreen Implement.
To begin with, just in case you guys aren't familiar with our sprayers, the displays are the same display that we use for our guidance displays, so everything ties in with that. We do have a couple displays out on a long harness that we could show you guys different setups if you have any questions on them. But a lot of the reason combining with our 2600, 2630 and the sprayers is to get all that documentation that we need. It's something that the government's wanting. If the government isn't wanting it, your landlord may be wanting it, and eventually the government will want it. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to tie everything together through that display, and so to make that happen, we have to have all of our documentation in there right. People that have been to our AMS class, they're familiar with that. If you haven't been there, if you have questions, just grab Paul or myself and we'll walk you through some of that to make sure you understand that. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it going forward from the beginning, but later on we'll gladly. The literature up here, go ahead and grab a book, take one. There's good information in there. And that's one thing we're going to be talking about to begin with. In our sprayer parts and accessories book, there's a spray chart at the beginning of it. If you go to get the T-Jet spray nozzles, you can get a chart from them. It's really nice because it's a sticky chart about this big around, and you just plaster it on the side of your sprayer, and you know exactly what tip you could go get for what different sizes, or tip size for different speeds and stuff. And working with sprayers for the past, well, I guess 96 is about when I first started really playing with sprayers. That's been the biggest thing that I run into. People don't really know what size of nozzles do we get. What are we trying to do? We've always ran a yellow nozzle. We don't know why we ran a yellow, except somebody told us that's the one to run, and we just run it, and the pressures, sometimes they're 75, sometimes they're 35, and that's what we run, and that's what we've always ran. So that's the thing that we need to start looking at more, because one thing we're seeing, well, the reality of it is when your pressure goes up, the atomization goes up. If you atomize it too much, it doesn't get down to the ground as good, and then the EPA doesn't like it because we're blowing that fine chemical around. You're going to get drift. It may not go exactly where you want. So bottom line, you're wasting some of your chemical. So getting our spray tip the right size to match our speed, that's where we're going to want to be starting at. The handy thing with the book is you can look in the book, hopefully find the page here, and you could just go right down the line. It tells you if you're wanting to go this fast and find how many gallons an acre you're wanting to apply, that will tell you what nozzle you could run. And then you can find out, well, I want to run from 8 to 14 miles an hour, so what nozzle is going to work for that? One thing that you do have to check, first of all, is go to your sprayer and see what your nozzle spacing is. If you've had the sprayer for years, you probably know what it is, but this one, you look at it, and it's 15-inch spacing. That isn't the standard spacing for out here, but if you're doing corn, that's going to be more what the standard spacing is, because they're going to shut off every other nozzle some of the time. Most of the pull-behind sprayers that have been out in the dry land all their life are probably set up at 20-inch spacing. If you have something different than that, you need to go through the formula to figure out what they have for different spacings, and or figure out your spacing and your pressure pattern. That way you get something set right. So grab one of these books before you leave. Nothing else. There's other information in there as far as different parts and accessories for it if you have one, a sprayer. And just because it's a John Deere book doesn't mean it only works on John Deere. The second book here has all the fittings, and that works with the Summers sprayer, any other sprayer, self-propelled or pull behind. But it's a handy book. Once you got the information for your sprayer, like we'll use Russ's sprayer here on 15-inch spacing, and right now he has the green tip on there. So if we look at the green tip, it's a 1.5, and with the green tip, what do you want to spray, Russ?
Well, I was going to do like 5 gallon roundup.
Okay. So if we look at 5 gallons, at 5.2 gallons, it's 7 miles an hour, but it's only 15 psi. So something else to look at on that sprayer is we have our nozzle bodies. There's a flow check valve on there. They could be 10 pounds, 12 pounds, or 15 pounds, or they could be stuck. So depending on what you have is going to depend on what your minimum pressure is going to be. If you have the sprayer set up wrong, when you take off and you go spray, and let's say we told it we only wanted to spray 5 gallons an acre, and we have too big of a tip on there, then it's not going to get enough pressure to open up all those check valves on there. So one thing to watch, and we'll go through a nozzle flow check here before we're done, and with Russ's we might kick it up to one of the bigger tips just so you can see what happens if we don't have enough speed on it. You'll go down your boom and you might have half of the nozzles on one boom not spraying. It says you're doing what you want, and it says your good pressure, or okay pressure, you're only 15, but you don't have everything open. So we're going to want to make sure that we get it set right. So looking at that then, we're not going to want to have it that size of tip if we're only going 7 miles an hour, because we're not going to open up all those orifices. So we'll keep on going on across, and when we're at 10 miles an hour, the pressure is 30 psi. So fairly good, depending on what tip you have. You shouldn't be scared to run that. And so how fast can we go before our tip starts being too atomized? If we go up to 16 miles an hour, then our actually it'd be about 15 miles an hour. Our pressure should be right around 65 at 15 miles an hour to get that 5 gallons. So that's going to be a fairly good tip to get you a wide range of spraying the application. The other thing with tips are knowing if it's a low drift or just a standard tip. Most of the tips that you're getting now are going to be low drift. I couldn't say for sure because I'm not with the companies making the tips or the EPA, but I heard one person was telling me that they're regulating it and you can't even go buy standard tip anymore. I don't know, Dean, have you heard if that's right, or?
I don't ever buy standards. So.
Okay, yeah, well, from what I heard, the EPA is going to make it to where you can't go just buy a standard. So the air induction tips, there's quite a few of those out there. So, and even the newer tips, the deer ones that they have, like this here has 2 AI tips on it, and the Guardian tip, which it's still an air induction, but it's not going to get as coarse of a droplet as the longer air induction tips.
Which one's the Guardian?
The Guardian is the one without the long tip on it.
Is that the red? Must be the red.
Yeah, the red is the Guardian on that one. So one thing with the Guardian, I'll try not to have too much of a sales pitch, but if you get the Guardians through here, they come with the strainers in there, and if you get the regular or any of the other tips, you get the strainer separate. So really price-wise with the Guardian tips, it has been a really good tip. We'll play with the nozzles so you can see the different patterns for them later on. They've held up very good. They are a poly tip, and most of the tips that you get now are poly tip. Have the little book here. It talks about the different tips, and it talks about the quality and how long different types of tips will last. So some of these poly, okay, they're saying the best one is ceramic, then the poly, then a PVDF, I'm not sure which one that is, stainless steel, then the worst one is a brass tip. So some handy information in there. Just, I know in the past people have said, I need to get a stainless steel tip. Well, now some of these polys are lasting longer than that stainless. So just something to look at on there. As far as the tips go, do you need strainers in them? It depends how often you want to clean them. If you do get strainers though, make sure you got a strainer that matches the size of the tip. You don't want to have the finest strainer out there and have a number 3 or 4 tip, because that strainer is going to be plugging up where a lot of stuff may go through it. You flush your system, you think it's good, but there's always stuff that gets in there, especially first thing in the year. As far as starting out the sprayer, I make sure it's flushed good, which we'll get to that part in a bit. The other thing with the tips is if it's a 4 Guardian tip or a 4 T-Jet or any other manufacturer tips, it's still going to be putting out the same amount of chemical. It's a 4. The pattern's going to be a little bit different, but you can mix and match them. Some people will say though, when you mix and match, all of a sudden the pattern out of this one isn't as good. Well, how old is that tip? Tips do wear out, and when they wear out, they start putting more chemical on than they did in the past. Originally, the tip may have put out 5 gallons an acre at 7 miles an hour at 35 psi, and now you're putting on more chemical at less psi because that tip is no longer restricting it. So another thing to watch for in tips is the direction of them. These Guardians are a directional nozzle, so as it's sitting in there, it's sitting like at a 20-degree angle, I believe it is, compared to the boom. Some guys will say we want to have everything facing the same way. The next person will say we want them staggering. Some of the deer places recommend staggering or alternating them one way, one the other way. Their reasoning for that is getting the coverage on the ground. If you're spraying into a canopy, if you have the leaves there already, if you hit them at that angle, then the other angle, you're going to be incorporating it underneath them better. The other people say, well, if they're all the same angle, you get it on the back side versus the front side. So that comes down to personal preference of what you want. As long as you have a good uniform pattern on them, that's going to be a big thing.
Small enough to know you, large enough to serve you.
Your locally owned John Deere dealer.
Evergreen Implement.